Sergio Leone movie in the title. But anyway, it's going to be animated, facilitated by Mr. David Simmons, and with the Honorable Medford Nicholas from Antigua, the Minister of Energy and Communication Technologies, as well as Dr. James Fletcher, the Chairman of CREE, which, I'll leave you the translation in terms of acronym, right, what it means, and Bruno Lemort in our team for East. You have the floor, Mr. David.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you back. We've gotten a little smaller than we were before the luncheon session. I hope it doesn't suggest that the lunch is having a negative impact on the stomach of those who were fed early on. But notwithstanding, we're just happy to have the ones who are here with us. Yes, as Monique indicated, I have been asked to chair this session, and we want to move right into it. This is a roundtable session, and essentially what we've invited a few other key experts in the field to participate in this session to share with us some of the knowledge that they have and gained over the years. So what we're going to do is, first of all, is to ask one of our members of our consultant team, Bruno, to make a first presentation, and he will present on the topic, the achieving renewable energy targets, how blue energy can be included in the mix, right? And then we will have the other members of our panel, as you indicated, Dr. James Fletcher from St. Lucia, but he's wearing several different hats, and he'll tell us which of the hats, or if any, that he's wearing today. But he's one of the more knowledgeable persons on the whole issue of renewable energy, having been minister in a government of St. Lucia some years back, and being a strong advocate for renewable energy, but more importantly, for the whole issue. And if you remember going back to when the Paris Accord was signed and getting the Caribbean countries to agree to move forward with 1.5 to Stay Alive initiative. But we'll say a little more about it later on. We also have here, speaking on the panel, the Honorable Minister Medford Nicholas from Antigua and Barbuda. So what we'll do is that we'll hear from Bruno first of all, and then we'll ask our panel members to each give a presentation, starting with Dr. Fletcher, just to respond to the presentation by Bruno, but also to give us their thoughts on how, on the topic for discussion is, how can we achieve that renewable energy targets and how blue energy can be included in the mix. So, given all the time, let me just call Bruno right up so he could start his presentation. Bruno?
Thank you, David. So, I will give you a short presentation about the role of marine renewable energies and how they can be included in the electricity mix on islands, especially on islands. The targets that we have seen today on the previous slides, all Caribbean countries have targets to achieve by 2027 or 2030. Regarding the share of the renewable energies in their electricity mix. However, there is things that need to be highlighted, is that transition to renewable energy and to the ideal target of 100% renewable energy is not only adding capacity in the mix. There are some statistics that I presented here on the slides that show that the resource itself, for example, for solar and wind, global resource, so worldwide, are sufficient to cover the world electricity demand in terms of capacity. However, the thing is that wind and solar are intermittent sources of energy. So when there is no sun or no wind, you cannot produce electricity with these sources of energy. And this is a limitation regarding the grid balance and how they can inject in the electricity mix. The wave energy can be a stabilizing power source, because wave energy, compared to wind and solar, it's consistent, reliable, and predictable. It has a much more steadier profile than wave and solar, and high predictability that you can see in the numeric modeling, meteorological modeling that we are using. And it can be used when the wind stops and when the sun is not shining. The studies that we have collected so far in the research works, academics works, show, I will show you here on this graph, that the wave energy, so it's the black line, has a very steady production profile compared to the solar, which you can see on yellow, and wind, which we can see on on gray here. This study was conducted on the west coast of the United States, but it's applicable to most of our countries. So you can see here that wave energy can be considered as a semi-base power source. Talking about the cost, because that's also something very interesting, and we had some slides this morning regarding the LCOE prices, so the cost of production of electricity. You have here some figures, and you will tell me, okay, wave energy is the most expensive. And it's right, because wave energy is a new technology, innovative one, which is just started to be expanded. And for all renewable energy sources, there is something that we call the learning curve, meaning to say that the first deployments, the price of production for the first deployments is always very high and tend to decrease with the number of new capacity that are added and included in the mix. So if you see the figures for wind onshore, at the beginning it was higher than $200 per megawatt hour. But now it's much less, because a lot of capacity for wind onshore had been installed. So wave energy will follow the same. However, even if it's at the moment one of the most expensive in terms of production, it has some benefits because of its steady production profile. And there is another study I would like to share with you. So it's still on the west coast of the United States, in California. They have studied different scenarios for covering their annual demand, electricity demand. And the first one was without including wave energy. So it's the graph you can see on the left. And the second one is including wave energy. So even with the higher cost of production, including wave energy, due to its steady profile, means to a reduction of the total installed capacity necessary to cover the global demand. You can see here. So it results in a less investment to fund to install 100% renewable energy in the mix. So including wave energy, that's what it's important to remember. Including wave energy, even if the cost of production may be higher, may result in decreasing the total investment necessary to go to the full transition to renewable energy. And that's the conclusion of my speech today, that wave energy is predictable, far in advance. It allows a better balancing of the production in the grid. It can produce even when there is no wind and no sun. And we strongly believe that to reach this 100% renewable energy target, we have to diversify all the possible sources of energy. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bruno, for that presentation, and in fact for providing what would be a summary of a lot of what we discussed this morning, but at least introducing something new to the discussion and the extent to which we're now seeing what are some of the possibilities and where we can make different entries, to what extent then an argument can be made for renewable energy to form part of that mix. So, as I said earlier on, we have a couple of members of our panel who we're going to invite to, first of all, give us some background information that they believe are critical to this whole issue of including wave and tidal energy as part of the energy mix, but also to respond to anything that would have stood out for them in the presentation by Bruno. So first I'd like to call Dr. James Fletcher. As I mentioned earlier on, he's the former Minister of Sustainable Development in St. Lucia, and he's continued his interest in the renewable energy sector. And just earlier this year, he was made chairman of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. That's a CARICOM body that is concerned with helping the countries of the region to really move forward with their efforts to introduce renewable energy, given the fact that we face such high cost of from the energy sources that we're utilizing right now. So at this point, I'd like to call Dr. Fletcher to provide us with some remarks and to also comment on the presentation we heard from Bruno. Jimmy?
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everyone. It's particularly pleasing for me to see my former colleague, Honorable Melford Nicholas. We fought many a battle at the telecoms level, so I'm happy to see you in St. Lucia and fighting another battle. And yes, to talk about energy. It's good that we are diversifying the renewable sources that we're looking at for enabling this transition for Caribbean small island developing states to a decarbonized future. For many of us, the options are really solar or wind. At least St. Lucia is lucky in that we have geothermal resources. But for islands like Antigua and Barbados that do not have geothermal resources, their options are really just solar or wind. So introducing energy from our oceans, be it wave, tidal, or another one that I did not hear you mention, which is actually a pet one of mine, and that's OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion, which I think, although the technology is still nascent and still a little cost prohibitive, but I think it also has the potential for transforming the energy landscape of our small island developing states, because it is a uniquely small island technology. So yeah, so for islands like Antigua and Barbados, when you introduce wave energy, it allows them now to start looking at how do they satisfy the need for baseload power, because as was quite adequately pointed out, both wind and solar are intermittent. The good thing about wind and solar is that sometimes they complement each other, so that when you don't have sun, that's usually when your wind profile is best, but you can't depend on it. The price of battery storage is going down, but again, that's not something that is still within the range of most of our economies to allow us to make wind or solar dispatchable. So any effort to broaden that base of renewable energy options is a good one. Clearly, there's a lot of work that has to go into it, but I think there are also some things that we need to do at our level to create the enabling environment that would allow, one, that level of innovation to take place, but secondly, to create the environment that independent power producers would feel comfortable coming into our area. One of them is to deal with the regulatory and legislative environment. In many of our countries, we still have electricity supply acts that are not conducive to the entry of independent power producers. In my own country, St. Lucia, for example, we're operating under an electricity supply act that gives the incumbent utility, Lucia, a monopoly for the transmission and distribution of electricity up until June 2045. So from 1965 to 2045, they have an 8-year monopoly. One of my last acts as a Minister of Responsibility for Energy in St. Lucia was to decouple generation from this. So it is now possible to, for independent power producers to come in and generate electricity from non-fossil fuel sources. But still for that, there was a suite of legislation that needed to accompany the National Utilities Regulatory Commission Act. The NUC was what we set up as the multi-sector regulator for both water and electricity. So there was a suite of legislation that was supposed to accompany that NUC and the amendment to the Electricity Supply Act that has not yet been enacted. So you find that you have a National Utilities Regulatory Commission, but you do not have the enabling legislation. You don't have, for example, a successor to the Electricity Supply Act that would allow for complete autonomy of any independent power producer coming in, so that they would know that the incumbent utility does not have any advantage in terms of concessions, in terms of benefits. That has not been put in place. So in almost all of our jurisdictions, we need to look at the legislative and regulatory environment to make the ground fertile for these things to happen. As it is right now, if an investor were to say, I want to come in and invest in wind energy, there would be, in wave energy, sorry, there would be a long process that would have to take place. That would really frustrate any investor. So that, I think, is the first thing that needs to happen. You also need to have a few energy champions in the region. It's something I've been speaking about. I spoke about it at CREF this year, and I'll repeat it again. The energy sector is one where you need someone. I'm happy that Melford is there because I know that he can and is playing that role in Antigua and Barbuda. But because our governments are preoccupied with so many different things, they're preoccupied with the high debt burden that they're carrying. And the high debt burden they're carrying, unfortunately, mostly because of extreme weather events that they've had to respond to. So every time there's a hurricane, every time there's flooding, every time there's a drought, our governments often have to borrow money to respond to that. Yes, we get some money from the World Bank. Yes, we get some money from the IMF. But most of that is in the form of a small grant and concessional loans. So our governments have found themselves in a corner with not much fiscal space. They also have other issues to deal with. They have health issues to deal with, education issues to deal with, rising unemployment, or at least stubborn unemployment among young people. So our governments very seldom see the transformative potential of the energy sector. Very seldom do they have the comfort of being able to step back and say, okay, you know what, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And the walking that we need to walk is in the energy sector. So while we deal with the imperatives of unemployment and debt and everything else, we need to make the investments in the energy sector that will allow us to completely transform our economies, transform every single economic sector on which Caribbean countries rely for development. So tourism, manufacturing, value added in agriculture. If we can bring the price of energy down from the stubborn 40 US cents, 45 US cents per kilowatt hour that it is right now, and it rose to as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, then you bring it down to maybe 20 cents, 25 cents, every economic sector becomes competitive. Your tourism sector becomes more competitive, agriculture becomes more competitive, manufacturing that is not competitive or not viable right now in any country, probably with the exception of Trinidad, becomes viable, becomes competitive. So that is something that is required. We need our governments to understand the transformative potential of the energy sector so that they can make the life of people like Devon at SICRI a lot easier, because there's still too much of a fight that our regional organizations have to be engaging with government in something that is good for them. So I think that's the other issue that is extremely important. We also have to look at capacity. In most of our countries, we do not have the capacity within the energy units. In fact, some of them don't even have full-fledged energy units. Energy is an appendage to something else. I remember when I was Minister of Responsibility for Energy, the first thing I found was that my ministry just did not have the capacity to deal with the plethora of investors who were coming down and saying to us that we can do this. I remember for geothermal, for example, investors ran the full gamut of those who would come in and tell me geothermal is very difficult in your country because your resource is very acidic, it's very corrosive, to those who would come and tell me we are oilmen from Texas and what we do is we drill and we can get that geothermal up and running in 7 months, 9 months. I say, but I thought geothermal really would take 7 years. They said, no, we can do it. And I quickly realized that we did not have the capacity to deal with any of these things. So fortunately, we were able to lean on people like Clinton Climate Initiative, Carbon War Room, Rocky Mountain Institute. They gave us that support. Now you have SICRI that's providing support with integrated resource planning, which is something that Carbon War Room did before. So that capacity is being built up regionally, but it's still not present domestically. And again, I think that is something that we need to look at. How do we cause that capacity to develop? And also, how do we strengthen and support SICRI so that SICRI can do work in those jurisdictions where it is not possible and not practicable to have full-fledged energy units? So I think for me, those are the big issues. And also, how do we access financing? That is a big issue. The financing is probably the biggest issue that we have to deal with where climate is concerned, because the other hat I wear is climate change and climate action and now climate justice. How do we access financing? How do we access financing that is not just there and sitting in the GCF, but we don't have to run through and jump through so many hoops to get to. And that by the time we've gotten it, the problem that we're trying to resolve has multiplied 3 or 4 times, so that the financing that we've been able to mobilize is now inadequate for the problem that we're seeking to solve. I did a presentation today for the Media Institute of the Caribbean on climate justice and was talking to them about the adaptation funding gap for developing countries. That's way past the $100 billion annually that has been pledged by the developed countries and that they've not been able to provide to us yet. We have not had 1 year where we've had $100 billion being mobilized and put in the Green Climate Fund. And unfortunately, most of the funding that is put in there is, one, directed at mitigation, and secondly, it's in the form of loans. So what is happening is that the same people who are causing the problem that is now requiring us to respond are the ones telling us that, yeah, okay, we can give you money, but you have to borrow it from us at near market rates. And that doesn't make sense. It's the equivalent of you breaking my leg and then telling me that the crutch that I need to walk again, I have to buy from you or rent from you at market rates. That's what's going on. So that doesn't make any sense. So we have to look at a total reconfiguration of the green finance sector to make it much easier for countries like ours to access financing and to bureaucratically easier, but also the conditions through which we borrow that money, those have to be relaxed, understanding the resource limitations that we have. So those, I think, are my initial thoughts on this. I'm very happy that this is the direction in which we're moving. It is an imperative for us. As I said, it is what can allow us to transform our sectors. One thing I'm a little disappointed in our governments is that coming out of COVID, I think they should have used this as an opportunity to kickstart a whole new green transformation. I've seen a return to business as usual, so the same brown investments are what we're having, and that's a little unfortunate, but it's not too late. So, Mr. Chair, that is the direction, but I commend you on what you're doing, and hopefully we can get the legislative, the regulatory, the capacity issues, and critically the finance issues to make it happen. Thank you.
I just want to thank Dr. Fletcher for that very interesting presentation. He covered a much wider area than we initially asked him to, but I think it's very useful in the context of what we've been discussing today. So, the Honorable Nicholas is going to present also, as said, talk on the presentation, but also any thoughts that we may have in general about the whole subject area. This was introduced to you this morning, so I don't think you need any more introduction from me at this stage. Honorable Minister?
Yes, thank you. All protocols previously observed, and let me just say to my friend and colleague, I'm not your former colleague, Jimmy, I'm still your colleague, and as you can tell from his rhetoric here just now, we miss his interaction at the regional level insofar as the digital transformation and the ICT agenda. He was truly a voice of reason and a voice of much insight in those deliberations. Let me just give the audience here a perspective of where we are in Antigua in terms of our journey towards this zero carbon and some of the national commitments that we have made. Just a little insight as to Antigua for those of you who do not know. This is the size of the country, and basically these are some of our macroeconomic indicators. I would just want to further indicate that where we are with energy at the moment, we have a total installed electrical capacity of 77 megawatts. of power with a peak demand of 57. However, within that context, we have a challenge where there was no spinning capacity. Based on the unit models that we have in the energy system, most of which were generated by HFOs and diesel plants. For the larger plant, if it had to go offline, based on its size, or any two of the larger units to go offline, we would not be able to meet the demand, the peak demand for electricity. So what the government did back in, I think, 3 years ago, when the utility company came forward and said that they needed an additional 20 megawatts of capacity, the government had initially mandated that it had to be RE energy. And as those persons within the OECS would know, I think our friend from the OECS Secretariat had indicated that Antigua had embarked in 2016 on solar initiative, but because of the challenges we've had with battery supplies, which I mentioned this morning, it wasn't a very good experience for us, even now. And so solar was problematic. It was a problem child. And looking at wind, that too, the time cycle for us to be able to land wind was a particular problem. And so what we made a determination on is that we would go to this transition fuel, which is LNG. And based on the PPA provider that we had already an arrangement with, they were able to produce a hybrid LNG plant that could also utilize diesel. But that LNG facility, the minimum unit that we could go to was for a 40 megawatt unit, which is what is now being installed in Antigua and should come live in October of this year. Having said that, it is to be understood that this is not the end of the game for us. When I raised this issue earlier this year at the CREF meeting in Miami, a number of eyebrows were raised, and I'm sure my friend Devon was at that meeting, as to where's Antigua going with LNG. But the option that we have, we also have an LNG facility that's going to allow us to fuel the cruise ships that are now transitioning towards LNG. So there is an economic opportunity there for us to do that as well. We noted, and I mentioned this in the meeting with the U.S. Vice President in the Bahamas a week and a half ago, in relation to and in discussion as well with the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, that arrangement that seemed to have stalled, where Trinidad and Tobago was given the option of working out an arrangement with LNG with Venezuela, only at the end of the day to be told that you cannot transfer any cash to Venezuela. That seemed to have been a stall, but we are discussing that with our friends in the United States. But I move on. We have approximately 13 megawatts of that troubled solar plant in Antigua. It does produce some energy, but of course, the usual problem that we have when the sun goes down, the stability of the grid, if it were dependent on that, would be a particular challenge. Across the board, based on an early initiative, we have about 2.3 megawatts of distributed renewable energy generation within the population, but that too has been stalled simply because of the model of integration that was worked out with the local telco, the local utility company, in that the net billing arrangement seems to have taken away the attraction for persons to make this continued investment. It's an area, now that I've assumed the responsibility for public utilities, that I've given an indication that I want to review to encourage more of this particular adoption. And of course, as you can see from the next line, we are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, HFO, diesel, gasoline, and you can see the numbers there. And of course, based on the historical problems we have had with energy in Antigua, almost every business in Antigua is equipped with its own standby plant, so there's a large standby emergency, of course, driven by fossil fuels as well. In Barbuda, and Jimmy would be happy to know that when we moved away from, we tried to bring back Barbuda after the hurricane in 2017. We were funded with some support from our friends in the UAE And of course, even more recently, we got some additional funds from the UK regime to be able to develop a hybrid solar facility in Barbuda. And so Barbuda has approximately 70% of its energy being provided by solar, and only in the evening do we have diesel standby plants. And of course, it has full battery backup as well. So Barbuda represents perhaps maybe one of the few islands, little islands, where there is this particular type of profile for utilization of energy. The rest of the slides are basically just giving you background information, but let me take this opportunity to say that insofar as what Jimmy said earlier about the limited options that we have for renewable energies, we have made a commitment at all of the international fora that by 2030 we should have 86% of our energy consumption should come from renewable energy. I believe early on in the presentation today, when the graphs were put up, you had seen how far away we are from achieving the target. So we literally cannot take micro steps to get there. We're going to have to take some quantum leaps. At my recent attendance at the IRENA meeting in Barbados, I was expressing quite a bit of interest in wind energy as the next alternative, the next option, the next viable option. And in fact, there is a pending visit by me to the Wigton farm in Jamaica. I certainly had a conversation with your Prime Minister, Devon, 2 weeks ago when we met in the Bahamas. But the option now of marine options, marine renewable energy options, has a certain ring of appeal to me. The question that I anticipated this morning and I asked earlier was answered this afternoon. I'm not sure that it makes me any happier, because the unit costs of production, I was anticipating that it would be far cheaper than has been posted. So that is something that we're going to have to discuss. I learned a long time ago in the private sector that being at the cutting edge of technology is also the bleeding edge. So that really suspends my enthusiasm a little bit if at the end of the day the technology is not yet fully robust and developed. And I had asked a question this morning, where has it been commercially implemented? And it is from those instances where I would follow the path and to look at the best practices and to see what are the pitfalls in going one particular direction or the other. But it still does represent an option, a technology option for us as we continue to move in this particular direction. I want to pause there and to allow for the discussion to take place, because I'm aware too that Jimmy has to leave us in short order. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again, Mr. Lucia, for the presentation. Roundtables are intended to provide an opportunity not just for the panelists to have discussions among themselves. Yes, not just for the panelists themselves to have a discussion, but also to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask them certain questions based on their presentation or the presentation by Bruno too. So I'll use this opportunity to find out from you if you have any particular questions for them before I try to engage them in a discussion on some of the things that they presented. Do we have any questions in our audience? Yes. Dr. Gardner? Oh.
People get tired, huh?
Thank you. So just wanted more of a comment than a question at this point. The conversation around the LCOE, our levelized cost of electricity, is one that we always have to be careful of in terms of comparing technologies with technologies. And I would say that especially against the standpoint of what my good friend, Honorable Melford Nichols said. Because in principle, when you're looking at LCOE, it is looking at the cost of producing electricity to the injection, the point of injection in the grid. And there are lots of other parameters which are not taken into consideration in terms of the total system benefit and the total system cost. And I think the colleague had made a good point of showing in his last slide how the system's benefit could actually improve in terms from a cost standpoint, even though you are having technology, wave technology, which has a higher LCOE in the system. As a case in point, we know that wind and solar at 6-7 cents per kilowatt hour is cheaper than some of the other options. Let's say solar with battery, which is coming in at 12 cents, would be more expensive. But the rectifications that would need to be made if you are putting in large amounts of intermittent or variable solar or wind into your system in the grid service operation could actually cause the cost of your system to operation to go up.
Excuse me, let me just say, I just can't exit without saying thank you all for accommodating us. Minister, I want to say publicly, thank you for taking all the time, because I know how important the time is for you and like Petra. You've been there, so you must know when you hear the minister takes the time to come over here, because he sees some value in this. So,
thank you, sir.
thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
From India.
Yeah. Cheers. Yeah, so I just wanted to raise the point around LCOE and typically and say that two things. One, all renewable energy technologies are not created equal, and we have to look and understand what the value of each technology is to the overall system and what that means in terms of the total system benefit and total system operating cost. And two, we also have to understand where there are opportunities for co-benefits from some renewable energy technologies. Jimmy spoke about OTEC, waste to energy is another one. A lot of those technologies, what typically happens is that the cost of the development of the system is placed squarely on the power sale side of the system, even though that system may be providing co-benefits that are also monetizable. In the case of OTEC, there's water, there's aquaculture, and other, other co-benefits that could be monetized. But nevertheless, we always compare the LCOE of OTEC system based on the total cost of developing an OTEC and linking that back to a power sale that is a PPA that is going to provide all the investment back with the returns and not look at all the other pieces. The same happens with waste to energy, which is why we have no successful waste to energy projects in the CARICOM region. There are some in the Caribbean, but not in the CARICOM, because we always, and David, you know that very well, I always complain about that, the cost of developing waste to energy technologies are always placed on the power sale side of things or in the power sector, and there's nothing that is, looked at in respect to how some of those co-benefits that are derived by the solid waste management sector could be factored into a cost model that allows for the cost to be shared. So I just wanted to put those cautions out there, and to end by saying that, and it's one of the things I will talk about when I speak in a few, that there are what we call innovative policy and regulatory models like sandbox legislations that could be used to cradle some of these nascent technologies to make them work and to help to, ascend some of these learning curves.
Yes, thank you very much, Devon. In fact, you've introduced some things there which I think ties in nicely with some of the discussion that we were having. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question, put a question to both the minister and the former minister. If I could take that liberty. Yeah, because what I was hearing this morning, and in fact, and what the minister talked about, the low part, if there's a low part of the discussion so far, is that he's not hearing how that cost, has come down to a level that would make it attractive right now. But I also heard Dr. Fletcher talk about the need for the funding agencies to be a lot more creative in how they provide financing. But at the same time, when we talk about new technologies, we know that governments don't necessarily invest in those technologies. The private sector are the ones who really steps up and gets involved. But if what you're saying there, one suggests that we need to be more creative in terms of the arrangements and the feeding of the grid, etc., etc., the question then becomes, are there opportunities for governments to step in and be more proactive in terms of funding those new technologies so that they can become more creative in dictating how that is distributed, under what circumstances and what conditions? Because if you leave it up to the private sector, invariably they'd be looking for the payback. How are they going to be repaid for the investment in those technologies? Gentlemen, any one of you wanted to comment on that? I'm particularly interested in trying to find out the extent to which there may be opportunities for governments to be a little more creative in how they want to step forward to fund some of those technologies, knowing that if they were to put their money into it, they become the authority in terms of how it can be utilized, how it can be distributed, and in what conditions.
From the standpoint, yes, from the standpoint of where I'm sitting, I do not know that with the options that are available to the government, for the government to make the investments, I think that there has to be a public-private partnership. And if the private sector, be it local or even regional or even international, sees the way, but the technology itself has to be viable in terms of the cost of implementation of a solution. So if, for example, the options that are available to Antigua is wind and solar, and now marine energy becomes another option that we can exploit. If, for example, to meet our 2030 targets, we were to put out an RFP indicating that we are inviting tenders to provide, let's say, 30 megawatts of power from one of these sources, are we likely to get takers if the cost is so high? And with having, obviously with the intention of lowering the cost to our consumers and to make it competitive, what could a power purchase agreement yield and to make a project such as the transition become viable? I think those are the options that we have to look at. And so when I'm looking, and I'm going to be interested in exploring, even with the assistance of CCRE, the whole question of the LCOE. I think I need to get my technicians and my energy council more in tune with some of these cost models before we get to the stage of inviting tenders to produce other sources of renewable energy.
Yeah, I agree with Melford. I can't see government taking this on its own. However, I think there's a space there for tertiary organizations being guided and led by CCRE, to look at that, because you're talking about technologies that have still not yet reached the point of commercial application. For a government to invest in those, again, given the limited fiscal space that they have at their disposal, it's a little difficult. However, if we do it on a regional scale, be it with tidal, wave, or OTEC, the transformative ability, the transformative potential of any one of these technologies is massive. And then when you start adding in other elements, so for example, if you were to get wave energy or OTEC going, you work out the technology, you've made it affordable, you've made it cost effective, you can now start looking at producing green hydrogen, because you now have an excess of energy production, way more than your domestic needs. So you can now start looking at producing green hydrogen. And I read somewhere that I think researchers in the University of Adelaide in Australia have been able to electrolyze seawater. So can you imagine now not having to desalinate seawater before you use it to produce green hydrogen, but producing green hydrogen directly from seawater? So the same seawater that you really talk about your blue economy really working there, because that ocean is producing the energy that is helping you get grid stability, have baseload power, but you're also now using the water in your ocean, you electrolyzing it, and you're producing green energy that can now power your cars and power so many other things. But again, that's technology that is not yet ripe. So how do we cause maybe a fund to be created to make that happen. A fund that is managed at the regional level with CCRI, with CARICOM. Those are all things that we need to look at because, again, as I said, the transformative potential is huge. That can do for us what fracking did for the United States of America. And I think that's the scope at which we have to dream. That should be one of our moonshots for our region. But to ask any one government to do it, it's not going to happen. They don't have the fiscal space to make that happen.
So you're suggesting that it would have to be more or less at a regional level?
And as Melford said, or PPP, a public-private partnership,
yes, sure, thanks. Anybody else wanted to comment on that particular subject? Yes.
Okay, so I will have one question, one for each one of you. So one for James Fletcher first. You have spoken about reprogram the green finance in a proper way so that to be able to finance these systems. So this morning we had the question: how much time do you need to go to the end of the feasibility study? So that's the answer from me. So what is the time you need to reprogram a finance program so that to fit to these systems? What is the necessary time to get a new funding program able to finance these programs?
I think if I could answer, well, no, I don't want to answer for the minister. but I think the minister has said previously that for governments, particularly presiding governments, they have a certain time frame in which a window in which they operate, a 5-year window.
Yes.
But anything that comes after a 3-year period, it becomes difficult to plan long term. Right, Mr. Minister? That is correct. Yes. So I think coming out from the discussion we were having this morning, I think somebody asked the question. Right. So when somebody asked the question about how long does that take to come on stream, I think you mentioned about 3 years,
yes.
right? But the question, I think, when does the 3 years start? You see?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think what we're hearing
when does this 3 years start?
They're quite keen, they're quite interested in exploring, some opportunities that exist, notwithstanding the fact that right now it may still be to some extent cost prohibitive, or at least not within the range that most private sector entities would want to get into it, So if he's going to make a case where Antigua and Barbuda could explore some possibility of any pilot that's going forward, what is the sort of time frame within which you envisage something coming on stream or making plans that could come on stream so they could move forward with it?
24 months.
Yes.
So we need to do it in 24 months on our side too.
Yes.
And we see at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, and for Melfort Nicholas, I have a question for Mr. Melfort. Yes, honestly, Isabel.
1 second. Yeah. Unfortunately, Dr. Fletcher has to leave at this time. It was the only condition on which we knew that we were going to get him to pass it. So we really want to just appreciate the fact that he came out. So, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, because you wanted to stay.
No,
You wanted to stay.
yes.
Right.
That's
Thank you
right.
very much.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry for the little pause there.
So for the second question, it was for Mr. Minister Melfort Nicholas, because you've spoken about the LCOE, so the value of the project, and I wanted to highlight that in this value, some part when you pay for this amount for the kilowatt hour, do you value the part that remains local? Because sometimes the price of the kilowatt hour is very low, but the part of this price that is paid does not come back to the country. It goes internationally to the capital owners. So in the program we propose, we value a lot the return to the local economy. So maybe it's more expensive, but we have to compare as the whole, not only on the price of the electricity, but on the value for the local economy also. So maybe it's better to pay a little bit more, but it stays in the country.
My reticence comes from the fact that I know that there will be. Yes, I can agree with you, but my reticence comes from the fact that there is an unknown. And so the feasibility study, I am still committed to getting that done. At the end of the day, a significant portion of our balance of payments are due to expenditure on fossil fuels. And so within the next 7 years to get to 2030, and we were to eliminate even 40% of that, it would be significant cost savings to our economy in terms of where our foreign exchange goes. So yes, there is that attendant benefit, but still at the same time, we're speaking about making an investment in the future where we want to be competitive. And I know when Devon brought the conversation into our discussion earlier today about whether or not can this renewable energy that we're getting from these sources, whether or not we all have to put it on the grid for current consumption, or we can use it to spawn other industries, such as the production of green hydrogen or any other matter for that point. I was saying over lunch today, you know, looking at something that is entirely a Caribbean creation, our steel pan. I've looked, and I mean, from all resources we just use. Back 100 years ago, after the last World War, we converted the steel drums that brought fuel into the region into a musical instrument. And we've always depended on the byproduct of these packages to create our own steel band. I know that in Trinidad, for example, in Chaguanas, there is an active used metal industry going on, but we're still trading in primary products. They're not converting it or retooling it or repurposing it into other metals or other derivatives to create finished goods. And with a cheap source of energy, I'm sure that there is some creativity even amongst our young students here from this Arthur Lewis School. I'm hoping that one or more of them would become inspired to say that there is an opportunity in the renewable energy field for us to do something else. So I see the potential benefits, but at the same time, I want to be clear that with the completion of the study, that we know exactly where we're going. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Minister. I just wanted to add something because we talk about public-private partnership, PPPs. The new regulation in EU, because we're just trying to find source of funding donors, you know, what they're looking for. There's a new trend here. We're talking about PPPs, and PPPs which are concentrated on the benefit to the population. So they enlarge, they enhance, okay, the best value for money. And it, you know, like Corinne said before, you know, it's not just economics, it's not just money, but so the European Union right now, they have a working group concentrating, I mean, targeting projects that would benefit the population in terms of, you know, education, in terms of job, in terms of innovation. And so I would say that if this criteria is there, okay, the public donors will enhance their funding So maybe the balance would be more public than private, meaning compensating the return on investment from the private sector to public funds. So there is like a brainstorming and a lot of thoughts right now on how to promote and develop PPPs on projects that really has a real impact on the population to improve their daily life. So, and that would be interesting to raise this issue when we organize the next workshop in Brussels, because I think that they're really interested to know what's going on and what could be alternative mechanism of funding and how to reward the funding by performance criteria. Let it be education, let it be transfer of know-how, all these kind of things, which are not necessarily economic, but will definitely aim to improve the quality of life of the population.
Sure. Devon, Monique?
Sorry, I can see you.
Yeah, so just to bring this around to where we started some of the conversations and trying to get to the jugular of Minister's question. There are good examples of PPPs around the region, not in the energy sector so much, but more so in infrastructure. Jamaica with the road network, that's one of those that is spoken about all over the world. It's a social good, but also leading to economic prospects, funded totally by the private sector with public regulations and backing that ensures that the private sector gets return on its investment, and ensuring that the citizens are paying a price that is affordable. The port in Antigua, the airports in Jamaica also. Yeah, benefit, but exactly. So within the question, within this context, PPPs, yes, could work for some of these nascent technologies, especially in the context of those who are involved in the development of the technologies themselves and have a skin in the game, and who will be prepared to back the technologies with either their own money or with money from their partners. What is required, as I mentioned earlier, is some kind of framework, because to send these kind of projects to compete on an even keel in a mature procurement process with solar and wind, where they are going to be evaluated and the same criteria, is not going to cut it, because they will always come out third and fourth and fifth in any bid rounds unless there are specific arrangements to cradle these. And that's why the experience of Bermuda with the sandbox legislation is one that I will again raise, where there is a piece of legislation that is an amendment to the Electricity Act that allows for certain types of technologies that would not normally find themselves in a competitive procurement tendering arrangement, that could have these kind of what you call deep economic benefits, and which are relatively new to the market. OTEC and such alike, WAVE and some of them have been raised. These technologies would then be treated within that context, within that sandbox legislation. That then tends to bring the developers who have the technology and the money to the table, and to help to facilitate a test bed for these technologies to be integrated in the system. And to the minister's point, you don't want to have a situation where you're procuring 30 megawatts in a 75 megawatt system, and you're predicating that a new technology. Cayman and the guys in Cayman and I, we had that conversation where there was a push to integrate 30 megawatts of OTEC into a 180 megawatt system, and I opposed it when my views were sought, because you don't want technology which is unproven, untested, to form a large base of your system, because if it fails, then your system could collapse. But you try to create within your system a pocket that is allowable. It's like going to bet. You don't want to bet your house. You bet something that you could afford to lose. So that in the event that the system, that it fails, it doesn't affect the reliability and the stability of your system. So, there are ways and means and innovative ways to kind of figure out how to get it into your system.
Yeah, thanks. I'm hearing a certain thing in the discussion that's coming through. And I don't know if I'm correct to say it, but you could tell me that the issue really is the ability of any new power that's been developed, how it feeds into the grid, or the extent to which it's allowed to be fed into the grid, given the fact that you have the power producers who already have that monopoly on the supply of electricity. Is that the issue that we're hearing? Is that
not just the grid? I mean, in general, how do you integrate it in your energy mix? The grid
yes.
being one part of the mix.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. But in terms of what's really the main constraining part is that you have the power companies who already have a certain monopoly, and that anything that is new that is brought into the mix, one has to some extent involve them in the discussion or go through them because of the legislation.
Well, in the power part, yes.
Yes.
In the power part.
Right. Okay. And that
is the case in some jurisdictions,
yes.
but such as Antigua, but in some jurisdictions like St. Lucia and even in Jamaica and Barbados, that's not the case because there's deregulation of the generation sector. Yes. So in countries where the generation sector is deregulated, the utility really doesn't have control over who comes onto the grid in terms of an IPP. Yes. That is usually prescribed by law and usually run through clearly articulated procurement processes. But even in those instances, a utility that is nervous, because remember the utility is a grid service operator, a utility that is nervous about a significant amount of its baseload generation coming from unproven technologies can be a problem, even if it is that the utility is not required to approve, it will be a problem.
Yeah, yeah, and I asked the question because I just wanted to just share, I think, because I've been doing some research in the whole area of the law of the sea, and I was particularly interested in initiatives that the government of Antigua partnered with the government of Samoa in talking about the whole issue of loss and damage, and introducing that as we as small island states, we are the ones suffering most from climate change, and as a result, you are polluting the environment, and we are the ones suffering, and you have a certain obligation to compensate for that loss that we suffer, right? Now, normally with law, one has to show that somebody is held liable for creating any sort of damage. But if there is no law, then it means that you have to find a way to agree for the international community to say that, yes, something should be created, right? So we become a little more creative in terms of how we apply and interpret the law, right? And I'm saying that given the fact that we're talking about energy from a source that has not traditionally been an energy supplying source, I think it opens a little window of opportunity for us to say, hey, this is not your usual energy source. So it means that the rules of the game in terms of how we use that energy, how we supply it, how it's used, how it's distributed, should not be subjected to the same rules that applied with the traditional sources.
We must learn lessons from renewable energy, right, David? Because the same could be said about solar and wind 20 years ago in the Caribbean context. Because when 20 years ago it wasn't common for us to use solar and wind as sources of energy in the Caribbean. Likewise, fast forward to now, it's not common for us to use the sea as a resource. So what will usually happen is that you will hear how developed the technologies in some jurisdiction elsewhere in the world, and why is it that there should be special provisions. So bottom line is the bottom line. In respect to energy, the Caribbean has to be cognizant of the fact that we will have to solve our own energy problems. The developed world is not going to solve it for us. We have tried this for 20 years. But one of the things that we find is that if you try to go through the green climate mechanisms globally, like the GCF or the Adaptation Fund, to generate resources, and Jimmy said it earlier, for financing an energy, a sustainable energy project, there are two things. One, it's likely to come through mitigation. It's most likely to come through mitigation, which means it's going to come as a loan. Two, if you try to push it through adaptation, the amount of time and money that will be necessary for you to, as you said, prove the adaptation case with historical data, which oftentimes you don't have, because we're trying to right now to develop what we call an EGAP program, which is the development of a electric grid adaptation program to get adaptation money to fund the upgrades for the grid, recognizing that the grid is one of the most vulnerable pieces of the net system to the climate and the climate impacts that are worsening. And when we sit with the climate experts to start thinking about what data is needed to create the case, it's 2 years of work and $4 or $5 million US before we can even put a proposal before the GCF. So that's why Jimmy spoke about the hoops and the things that you have to go through. I think where government, can do things quickly to help themselves, they have to, and that's why putting in place some kinds of legislation that can attract those private sector companies who are forward-thinking and outward-looking to do work in the countries and some of these areas and some of these technology areas would be useful. And government could then complement that with helping the private sector to incentivize the private sector with grants from global public sources where those are available. A lot of times when governments access grants, like we did with the UAE Project Milford, and we get it available to us, what we do is we try to create these very small pockets of projects that are public sector owned, because governments like to kind of ring fence these grants and treat it as a government-owned project, rather than use it as leverage to attract the private sector to build a bigger project that could have, more value, cascading value. So that is how I think, we can create a bootstrap approach.
But that's a very good point, you see. And I think what the private sector need to do is to be a little more creative themselves in terms of how they could partner with governments. Because at the end of the day, how do you choose one particular private sector entity as opposed to others?
Well, government haven't set the bar.
Yes. But the discussion must take with the private sector too, because I don't think they think primarily along in the returns that they must get, on the investment, and not so much in terms of what are the benefits that would accrue over long term. Yes, we've heard about the blended finance part, et cetera, but at the same time, we're not seeing anything new or creative that address those kinds of issues that you have raised, But, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, the discussion is going nice, but I think we have to take cognizance of the fact that there's another session that's supposed to come through. So let me just find out if there's anybody else with any particular question that they want to raise for the panel.
Thank you.
One of the students, I want to hear from them.
Yeah.
You know, silly questions?
There are at least two who didn't speak. You asked a question before, right?
No, don't put them on the spot that way. But, yeah.
Maybe you can present yourself, okay?
Yeah.
They can introduce themselves and say what they are interesting, or what did you notice, or something that struck you, or something that you would like us to,
Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Anelia Hilaire. I think maybe a question that I might have is in terms of, maybe two questions. I think one, I would like to know what's missing to prove that wave energy is going to be reliable to provide enough energy for the Caribbean. And I think another question that I have is in terms of how much energy is produced. When you have less violent or strong waves, you would obviously have less energy, right? So I want to know in terms of how much consumers would pay for electricity, how would that vary? I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly. Yeah, I don't know.
Other questions before somebody answers? No? You sure?
Monique, let's let Corinne do that first question.
Okay, Corinne, you want to answer?
No, I have no question.
No, I said you want to address, the question that has been raised. Okay.
Just try to answer with simple ideas, because this is a complex system. So we deal with statistics. You have statistics during your scholarship, I think. So these systems with small waves sometime and high waves sometime, you deal with statistics. You say how many time I have this level of wave, how much time I have this other 8 of waves. There are some other factors, but I will not enter into details. It makes a wool, and you produce electricity not at the same level, just like the solar panel. They don't provide electricity at the same level each time. So that's exactly the same. And when we were saying that it is more steady, it means that it varies slowly. When the sun, if you have a cloud, it varies very suddenly. And the wind varies less suddenly, but with a certain rhythm. The waves, they vary slowly. That's what is interesting. But the people, they will have always the same electricity. It will not come from the same source. So you have just like a river, you come together, and you provide electricity from a diesel plant, and at the same time from wind or solar, and at the same time with wave, and all come in the same river at the end. That's the idea. And let's say you always have electricity, because you have people in the electrical companies doing, the work of balance of the electricity. But us, we are provider of electricity for that. Okay? I don't know if there was another question.
Okay.
I think there was a question that you asked.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the first.
What is preventing? What's missing?
Yes.
So, okay. I thought you did. So who has the answer to that?
Mr. you asked a question that I also need an answer.
Maybe I can try.
Oh,
I'd like to try. I'll make an effort to answer your question at the risk of being slaughtered after.
No.
Just like with every new technology that comes up, what's already existing requires a certain length of time to see its viability, it goes through certain tests. Let's work with the word test. Right now, I have no vocabulary for it. It has to go through a rigorous testing period. For instance, let's look at solar. When solar first came out, if I could remember my history, gentle persons, correct me if I'm wrong, persons doubted that it was even good enough. The first set of solar panels were not generating enough power to do anything substantial. It was more for demonstration purposes. They couldn't really get it up to scale. Time has passed. Now, solar panels have other thing. The efficiency of solar panels are constantly increasing. The pliability of it, meaning how they can fold it, it doesn't have to be as rigid as we know it to be. The applications have grown. So over time, it has proven itself to be something that can, one, produce the amount of power that is required. Two, with our natural issues that are happening and everything else around the world, it has proven to be able to still stand. So just like these examples, with a technology like this, while it might not be very new, but it coming up as a runner now to want to be up to what we call utility scale, to produce that amount of power. Persons are still watching it as it's a newcomer into the system, and can it really stand the test of time? So there's that component. Not that it does not work, but you would appreciate, if you're new to something, nobody really wants to take a chance on you in a hurry. Not that it's right, but that's what it is. Have I answered that sufficiently?
Yeah, I think you have that every technology needs time to be tested, as I said, rigorously tested over some period of time. Now, that doesn't say that wave tidal energy is new. It's been around for, I mean, a long time, because I remember when, first started, studying the whole history of international law of the sea, right? We heard the extent to which it, that represented a new frontier in opportunities for growing the ocean sector. And one of the things that was mentioned was ocean technology, ocean energy, wave energy, right? But the problem is that over the years, it has taken some time to get the technology to the level where it's at today. And as Fabian just indicated, like solar energy, the efficiency, it's becoming more and more efficient. Mine is not as comparable as yet, or at the same level as some of the other renewable energy technologies that are there, right? But what we're saying is that in any sort of renewable energy package, you're going to have different sources of providing that energy. And wave tidal energy represents one of the sources. So when you pull it all together, and if you're going to need X amount of kilowatts or megawatts, in a country, the extent to which some of that can come from a different source, it only adds to it. So I think it goes to the heart of our question in terms of the need to look at it as a possibility. So for some countries, it may not be possible. They may have other things. And I think from our discussion with the folks in St. Lucia, what we hear is that they have certain priority areas that they're looking at. And what we're saying here as part of this feasibility study is that we have now looked at, or we're looking at the possibility of wave tidal energy coming into the mix. And if it can be brought in at a reasonable price, then when you look at it and when you pull all together, the average cost of a renewable sector would still be on par with our traditional sources. So that's what makes, to some extent, makes it viable, and that's what, to some extent, we continue the conversation, right? And taking into consideration everything, the minister said in terms of the time that we need to kind of get things going, the fact is that we're doing a feasibility study, right? The next stage would be a pilot, right? I think the question that's been asked, everybody's asking is, how long is it going to take to get that pilot going? That would really answer a lot of the questions that were asked here today about the cost, the efficiency, and what percentage of that renewable energy mix can it satisfy, So I think we need to get to that next stage, but I think, and my other colleagues could probably answer that question, to what extent have we seen sufficient interest being demonstrated that would say to the funding agencies, yes, this is something that we could invest in because we see a great demand, a great interest in it, And I think from what we've been hearing and what we'll probably hear later on, the extent to which there may be, I think Jimmy Fletcher mentioned it, the need to look at, something from a regional level. I think all of that points to the fact that we need to give it some serious thought, but working with our regional partners.
Thank you very much, David.
Yes.
I think it's time to wrap up the first round table. Thanks
Just
all the panel members. Bruno, Dr. Fletcher left already, and we're gonna go to the second round table, and the idea was that that people are tired. We going to heading to the end of this workshop, so we might suggest to take a coffee and come back. At the same time, we can work on the second round table. So those who want to get the coffee and come back if they want, so we keep rolling and maybe end up the workshop a little bit earlier for everybody to avoid